The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Ashford estate that Tuesday morning, turning the manicured gardens into a blur of green and gray. Inside the sprawling mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, the usual rhythm of wealth continued undisturbed. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over marble floors, the faint hum of expensive appliances, the soft footsteps of staff moving through hallways like ghosts. And among those ghosts was Grace. Grace Holloway had worked at the Ashford mansion for 7 years. 7 years of washing sheets that cost more than her monthly salary. 7 years of polishing silverware she'd never eat with. 7 years of being so quiet, so careful, so invisible, that most days the family forgot she was even there. She was 34 years old, though her tired eyes made her look older. A black woman with gentle features and hair always pulled back into a tight bun, Grace moved through the estate with her head down and her voice barely above a whisper. She'd learned early that silence was survival in places like this. The Ashford family didn't mistreat her. Not exactly. They simply didn't see her. To them, she was part of the furniture, a fixture, someone who appeared when needed and disappeared when not. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, the matriarch, would pass Grace in the hallway without a glance. Her daughter Vivian treated Grace like a voice-activated device. Bark an order, expect compliance, move on. And then there was him, Preston Ashford III, 28 years old, devastatingly handsome, and absolutely drowning in inherited wealth he'd done nothing to earn. Preston was everything Grace wasn't: confident, careless, loud. He drove cars that cost more than houses. He threw parties that lasted until dawn. He treated the mansion like his personal playground and everyone in it like NPCs in his game. To Preston, Grace was particularly invisible. In 7 years, he'd probably spoken directly to her fewer than 10 times. But today that was about to change. Grace stood in the kitchen that morning, her hands trembling slightly as she held a worn envelope. Inside was a slip of paper, a bank statement she'd been too afraid to check for months. Her grandmother had passed away 8 months ago, back in her small hometown of Valdosta, Georgia. Grace had been sending money home for years, helping care for the woman who'd raised her after her parents died. The funeral had been simple. Grace had taken 3 days off, her first vacation in 4 years. She'd said goodbye, signed some papers with a lawyer she barely understood, and returned to Greenwich to continue cleaning other people's messes. The lawyer had mentioned something about an account, some inheritance, but Grace had been too grief-stricken, too overwhelmed to process it. She'd shoved the papers in a drawer and tried to forget. But last night, alone in her small basement room, something had pushed her to look again. The account number, the bank name, the instructions for accessing it online. She'd tried from her phone, but the website required verification she couldn't complete without calling. And calling meant speaking up, asking for help, being seen. The thought terrified her. Grace. She jumped, nearly dropping the envelope. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford swept into the kitchen wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost 3 months of Grace's salary. The guest bathroom on the 2nd floor. Someone's used it and there are towels everywhere. Handle it, please. Yes, ma'am, Grace whispered. Eleanor was already gone, heels clicking toward the foyer. Grace tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and climbed the stairs. The guest bathroom was indeed a disaster. Expensive towels crumpled on the floor. Water splashed across the marble countertop. Someone's cologne creating a cloud of scent so thick it made her eyes water. Preston's friends had been over last night. She'd heard them from her room, laughing, music pounding, the sound of bottles clinking until 3 in the morning. As she cleaned, Grace's mind drifted back to the envelope. The account. What if it was nothing? What if she went through the embarrassment of asking for help only to discover she had $17.42? But what if it wasn't nothing? Her grandmother had been careful with money, meticulous. She'd worked as a seamstress for 60 years, taking in alterations and mending at prices that seemed impossibly low. But she'd never complained, never spent unnecessarily. Save your pennies, Grace, she used to say. You never know when you'll need them. Grace finished cleaning and made her way back downstairs. The envelope felt like it was burning through her apron pocket. She needed to know. Today. Now. But to do that, she needed to use a computer, and the only accessible one in the mansion was in Preston's study. Are you hooked yet? Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't believe what happens when Grace finally sees that screen. Don't miss the moment that changes everything. The study was on the 1st floor, tucked behind the grand staircase. Grace had cleaned it 1,000 times, always when Preston wasn't there. It was his domain. Leather chairs, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with books he'd never read. She stood outside the door at 2 in the afternoon, heart hammering. She'd checked his schedule. He was supposed to be out meeting friends for lunch in the city. Grace knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The study was empty, exactly as she'd hoped. Rain continued to drum against the windows. The computer sat on the massive desk, screen dark. Grace slipped inside, closing the door behind her. Her hands shook as she approached the desk. She'd never sat in Preston's chair before. It felt wrong, like trespassing in a sacred space. But she sat anyway. The computer came to life with a soft hum. Grace pulled out the envelope, unfolded the papers with trembling fingers, and navigated to the bank's website. She entered the account number, followed the verification steps, created a temporary password. The screen loaded and loaded. Grace held her breath. The page refreshed. And then, "What the hell are you doing?" Grace's heart stopped. She spun around in the chair to find Preston Ashford standing in the doorway, still wearing his raincoat, water dripping onto the hardwood floor. His expression was somewhere between confusion and annoyance. I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, Grace stood so quickly she nearly knocked the chair over. "I needed to check something. I didn't think you're using my computer?" Preston stepped into the room, eyebrows raised. "Without asking? I'm sorry. I should have. I'll go. What are you checking?" His tone wasn't angry, just curious, like he'd discovered his dog could talk. Grace clutched the papers to her chest. "Just my bank account. I don't have a computer and I needed to see." Preston laughed. Actually laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laugh of someone who found something absurdly quaint, adorable in its simplicity. "You needed to use a computer to check your bank account?" He shook his head, amused. "Grace, right? That's your name?" She nodded, mortified. "You've been here, what, 5 years?" "7, sir." "7. Wow." He walked to his desk, glancing at the computer screen. "And you don't have online banking on your phone?" "I tried, but it needed verification and I didn't understand." Okay. He waved a hand, still smiling. "It's fine. Go ahead. Check your balance. I'm just grabbing something." He moved to the bookshelf, pulling out a folder. Grace stood frozen, mortified beyond words. This was worse than being yelled at. His amusement, his casual dismissal of her struggle, it made her feel smaller than she already did. But the screen was still there, still waiting. She sat back down, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Preston glanced back at her, that same amused smile on his face. "Must be important if you're willing to risk using my personal computer. What, you saving up for something? A car? A vacation?" Grace didn't answer. She clicked the final button. The page loaded. And when the numbers appeared on the screen, when the balance finally displayed, Grace's breath caught in her throat. Preston noticed. "Everything okay? Did you overdraft or?" He stopped mid-sentence, because he'd seen it too. Over her shoulder, from across the room, he'd seen the numbers on the screen. And they didn't make sense. Not for a maid. Not for someone who barely spoke. Not for someone invisible. Preston's smile vanished completely. He crossed the room in 3 strides, staring at the screen like it had just displayed an alien language. That can't be right," he said slowly. Grace stared at the screen, unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to process what she was seeing. Because the number wasn't $17. It wasn't $1,700. It was... The number on the screen didn't move, didn't change, didn't disappear like some cruel glitch. 4,047 392s. 18. Grace's vision blurred. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles went white. The room tilted slightly, like she was on a ship in rough water. And for a terrifying moment she thought she might actually faint. Behind her, Preston stood completely still. His mouth had fallen open slightly, his usual confidence stripped away and replaced with something Grace had never seen on his face before. Genuine shock. "Is that..." He leaned closer to the screen, squinting like the numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. "Is that real? That's actually your account?" Grace couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. All she could do was nod, barely, while her mind screamed at her that this had to be wrong. A mistake. A typo. Banks made errors all the time, didn't they? But the account details were all there. Her name, Grace Marie Holloway. Her grandmother's name listed as the original account holder, Dorothy Jean Holloway. The transfer date, 8 months ago, 3 days after her grandmother's funeral. How? Preston's voice had lost all its amusement. He pulled up a chair next to Grace, actually sitting beside her like an equal for the first time in 7 years. How does a... He caught himself, but Grace heard what he'd almost said. How does a maid have almost $5 million? Grace's hands trembled as she scrolled down the page. There had to be an explanation, some detail she was missing. Her grandmother had been a seamstress in rural Georgia. She'd lived in a modest house, drove a 20-year-old car, clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. This didn't make sense. And then Grace saw it, near the bottom of the page, a document attachment labeled Estate Settlement Final Distribution. She clicked it with shaking fingers. The PDF opened. Legal language filled the screen. Dense paragraphs of herewiths and whereases that made Grace's head swim. But Preston leaned in, his eyes scanning quickly, and after a moment, he let out a low whistle. Your grandmother owned land, he said slowly. A lot of land. He scrolled down. Outside Valdosta, 47 acres that had been in her family since 1874. Grace's heart pounded. She remembered that land, the old property where her great-great-grandparents had lived. Her grandmother used to take her there as a child, an overgrown plot with a collapsing barn and a house that hadn't been inhabited in decades. Grace had assumed it was worthless, just family history, a place to remember, not a place with value. There was a development deal, Preston continued reading, his voice taking on that tone people used when they were trying to process something impossible. A major commercial developer wanted to build a distribution center. They'd been trying to buy the land for 15 years, but your grandmother kept refusing. Then last year, he paused. Last year she finally sold, for $6.2 million. The room spun harder. $6.2 million. Her grandmother had been a millionaire, a multi-millionaire, and she'd lived in that small house with the leaking roof, had continued taking in mending for $5 a hem, had apologized every time Grace sent her money because she hated being a burden. After taxes, estate fees, and some charitable donations, Preston scrolled to the final page. The remainder was placed in a trust account in your name, to be transferred upon her death. He looked at Grace, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was no condescension in his eyes, only something like awe. She left you everything, and apparently never told you what it was worth. Grace finally found her voice. It came out as barely a whisper. She never said anything, never. I didn't know. She didn't want you to know, Preston said, pointing to a handwritten note that had been scanned into the document. The shaky cursive was unmistakably her grandmother's. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I hope you can forgive me for keeping this secret. I didn't tell you about the money because I wanted you to grow up strong, not soft. I wanted you to know the value of work, of humility, of earning your own way. The land was payment for everything our family endured on that soil. The generations who worked it, who suffered on it, who made something from nothing. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. Use it kindly. And know that every penny was always meant for you. Love, Grandma Dorothy. Tears blurred Grace's vision. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob building in her chest, but it came anyway, a sharp, painful sound that echoed in the quiet study. Preston stood up quickly, looking uncomfortable. He wasn't good with emotions. Grace knew that about him, knew that about all the Ashfords. They'd built walls so high around their feelings that genuine emotion made them squirm. I'll give you a minute, he said awkwardly, moving toward the door. Wait. Grace's voice was stronger now. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and turned to face him. Mr. Ashford, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle something like this. I've never had more than $3,000 at once in my entire life. Preston stopped, his hand on the doorframe. He turned back slowly, and Grace saw something shift in his expression, like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. You need a financial advisor, he said finally. A good one, not someone who's going to take advantage of you. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. My father has a guy, Jonathan Chen. He's honest, which is rare. I can set up a meeting if you want. Grace stared at him. You'd do that? Yeah. Preston shrugged, but it wasn't dismissive, just human. Look, I'm not going to pretend I haven't been a complete ass to you for 7 years. I barely knew your name until 10 minutes ago, but he gestured at the computer screen. This is life-changing money, the kind of money that brings out the worst in people. You're going to need help navigating it. Grace stood up, her legs unsteady. Thank you. That would. Thank you. Preston nodded, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you quit? He looked genuinely curious. 7 years working here. My family doesn't exactly treat the staff like family. Why stay? Grace considered lying, making up something about job security or benefits. But something about this moment, about having almost $5 million sitting in an account she didn't even know existed, made her want to tell the truth. Because I was invisible here, she said quietly. And sometimes invisible is safe. When you grow up black and poor in the South, you learn that being noticed isn't always good. Being invisible means being left alone. It means surviving. She met his eyes. Your family didn't see me, but they also didn't hurt me, and that was enough. Preston looked like he'd been slapped. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "That's really depressing. That's reality for a lot of people, Mr. Ashford." He nodded slowly, something like shame crossing his face. "Preston, just call me Preston. I think we're past the Mr. Ashford thing." Before Grace could respond, the study door burst open. Eleanor Ashford stood in the doorway, her face tight with irritation. "Preston, your father's been calling you for—" She stopped, noticing Grace. "Why is the help in your study?" The word, help, hung in the air like a slap. Preston's jaw tightened. "Her name is Grace, Mother, and she's using my computer to check something important." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "And you're allowing this?" "Yes." "How? Progressive of you." Eleanor's tone could have frozen water. She looked at Grace with the same expression she might use for a stain on her carpet. "When you're finished with whatever this is, the dining room needs to be set for dinner. We have guests arriving at 7. Grace felt herself shrinking again, becoming smaller. The money in her account suddenly felt fake, like Monopoly bills, because Eleanor Ashford was looking at her the same way she always had, like something to be used and dismissed. But then Preston spoke, and his voice was different than Grace had ever heard it. "Actually, Mother, Grace won't be available this evening." Eleanor blinked. "Excuse me?" "She's dealing with an urgent personal matter. Family inheritance. Legal documents. Very time-sensitive." Preston crossed his arms. "I'm sure Vivian can handle setting the table. Or, you could do it yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's face went through several shades of red before settling on a cold, controlled fury. "We'll discuss this later." She turned on her heel and left, slamming the door behind her. Grace stared at Preston. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did." He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm calling Jonathan right now. Can you take tomorrow off?" I don't know if..." That wasn't really a question. Preston was already dialing. "You're taking tomorrow off. We're meeting Jonathan at 10 a.m. at his office in Manhattan. I'll drive you." "You'll drive me?" "Unless you want to take the train." Which, given that you're now worth almost $5 million, seems unnecessarily humble even for you. Grace felt dizzy again. This was happening too fast. Everything was changing too fast. Preston held the phone to his ear. "Hey, Jonathan? It's Preston Ashford. I need you to clear your schedule tomorrow morning. I have a client for you. Someone who needs real help, not the usual hedge fund nonsense. Yeah, it's urgent. Trust me, you're going to want to take this meeting." He hung up and looked at Grace. "Done. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Dress however you want. Jonathan doesn't care about appearances." He paused. "Are you okay? You look like you might pass out." "I think..." Grace sat back down in the chair. "I think I need a minute to process this." "Take all the time you need." Preston moved toward the door, then stopped. "Grace, for what it's worth, I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not seeing you. For 7 years of not seeing you." He looked genuinely remorseful. "That changes now." He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Grace sat alone in the study, staring at the computer screen, at the number that refused to disappear, at her grandmother's handwritten note. Use it wisely. Use it kindly. Outside, the rain had stopped. Weak afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the desk. Everything had changed in less than an hour, but Grace had a feeling the real changes were only just beginning. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small basement room, a space barely larger than a closet with a single bed, a dresser she'd bought at a thrift store, and a tiny window that looked out at ground level where she could see people's shoes walking past, and stared at the ceiling until her eyes burned. $4,847,392.18. She'd checked the account 17 more times on her phone after leaving Preston's study, convinced each time that the number would have changed, that it would reveal itself as the cruel joke her mind kept insisting it had to be. But every time there it was. Real. Solid. Impossible. Around 3 in the morning, Grace finally gave up on sleep. She sat up, turned on the small lamp beside her bed, and pulled out the folder of documents she'd printed from Preston's computer. He'd insisted she print everything, create backups, keep records. He'd even shown her how to set up two-factor authentication and a strong password. It was strange seeing him be helpful, be present, be human. Grace flipped through the pages again, reading her grandmother's note for probably the 100th time. The shaky handwriting blurred as tears filled her eyes once more. I wanted you to grow up strong, not soft. Her grandmother had watched Grace struggle, had accepted the money Grace sent home every month, money Grace could barely afford to send, scraped together from a salary that barely covered rent and food, had let Grace work herself to exhaustion in a mansion where she was treated like furniture. And the whole time Dorothy Holloway had been sitting on millions of dollars. Grace didn't know whether to feel grateful or betrayed. Maybe both. A soft knock on her door made her jump. Grace? It was Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, a tiny Taiwanese woman in her 60s who'd been with the Ashford family for 20 years. She was the closest thing Grace had to a friend in this house. Are you awake? Grace quickly wiped her eyes and opened the door. Mrs. Chen, is something wrong? The older woman's face was creased with concern. I should be asking you that. Eleanor called a staff meeting for tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Something about boundary violations and appropriate workplace behavior. She lowered her voice. Grace, what happened yesterday? Preston never defends the staff, especially not to his mother. Grace hesitated. Mrs. Chen had been kind to her, but trust was a luxury Grace had learned not to afford easily. Still, by tomorrow morning, the whole house would probably know something had happened. I needed to use Preston's computer for something personal, Grace said carefully. Eleanor walked in and made a comment. Preston stood up for me. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. Preston Ashford stood up for you? To Eleanor? She actually laughed. I've worked here for 2 decades and I've never seen that boy stand up to his mother. Not once. What on earth did you need his computer for? Grace looked at the older woman's kind face and made a decision. Can you keep a secret? At my age, keeping secrets is the only power I have left. Grace gestured her inside and closed the door. In the small space, they sat side by side on the bed, and Grace told her everything. The inheritance, the land, the account, the money. When she finished, Mrs. Chen sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she started to laugh, a deep, joyful sound that seemed too big for her small frame. Your grandmother was a genius, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. She made sure you knew your worth before you knew your wealth. Oh, Grace, this is wonderful. Terrifying, but wonderful. I don't know what to do with it, Grace admitted. I don't know how to be that person, the person with money. Then don't be, Mrs. Chen said simply. Just be Grace, but be Grace with options. She squeezed Grace's hand. Do you know what options are worth? Everything. I came to this country with nothing. Worked my way from maid to head housekeeper, and you know what I learned? The people with options are the people with power. Now you have options. Grace felt something shift in her chest. Preston's taking me to meet a financial advisor tomorrow morning. Preston is? Mrs. Chen looked impressed. Well, maybe there's hope for that boy after all. I'm scared, Grace whispered. What if I mess this up? What if people find out and treat me differently? What if you finally get to live instead of just survive? Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. Grace, you've been making yourself small for so long, I'm not sure you remember how to stand up straight. Tomorrow you start practicing. After Mrs. Chen left, Grace tried to sleep again. This time she managed a few restless hours before her alarm went off at 5:30. She'd set it out of habit, forgetting for a moment that she wasn't working today. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't have to work. The realization made her feel untethered, lost. Grace showered in the tiny staff bathroom, then stood in front of her closet trying to decide what to wear to meet a financial advisor. Her options were limited: work uniforms, a few casual outfits, and one dress she'd bought 5 years ago for a cousin's wedding that she'd never attended because she couldn't afford the flight to Georgia. She chose simple black pants and a gray sweater. Professional enough to be taken seriously, she hoped, but not trying too hard. At 9:30, she climbed the stairs from the basement level and emerged into the main house. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, making everything glow. Grace had cleaned these hallways thousands of times, but this morning they looked different. She couldn't quite explain why. Preston was waiting in the foyer, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, car keys in hand. When he saw Grace, he smiled, and it was a real smile, not the smirk she'd seen on his face 1,000 times before. Ready? he asked. Before Grace could answer, Eleanor appeared at the top of the grand staircase. She descended slowly, her eyes fixed on Grace with an expression that could have frozen the sun. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday," Eleanor said, her voice dangerously calm. "We have guests arriving this afternoon. The house needs to be prepared." "I told you Grace is taking today off," Preston said, his tone matching his mother's for temperature. "And I'm telling you that's not acceptable. We don't run a charity here. If Grace wants a personal day, she can request it through proper channels with 2 weeks' notice." Grace felt herself starting to shrink again, starting to apologize, starting to become invisible. But then Preston stepped between her and his mother. "Actually, as of this morning, Grace no longer works here." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor stared at her son. "Excuse me? She's quitting. Effective immediately. I accepted her resignation about 5 minutes ago." Grace's heart stopped. They hadn't discussed this. She hadn't resigned. What was he doing? Eleanor's face went pale, then red. "You accepted. You don't have the authority to accept staff resignations. I manage the household and I—" "Did you know?" Preston interrupted, his voice conversational but with an edge Grace had never heard before. "That Grace has been sending half her salary home to help care for her grandmother for the past 7 years? That she's been living on essentially minimum wage while working 60-hour weeks? That in 7 years she's taken exactly 3 days off? That's hardly relevant." "It's completely relevant, because while she was sacrificing everything, we treated her like she was invisible, like she didn't matter, like she was just part of the scenery." Preston's voice grew harder. "Well, she matters, and she deserves better than this." Eleanor looked at Grace with something close to hatred. "How dare you? After everything we've given you—" "Given her?" Preston laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mother, we've given her nothing. She earned every penny she made here, and we paid her as little as legally possible while working her to exhaustion. If she's so unhappy, she's welcome to leave. That's exactly what she's doing." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Fine, leave. But don't expect a reference, and don't expect to find anything comparable. You have no education, no special skills, and—" "She has $4.8 million in the bank," Preston said flatly. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Eleanor actually took a step back. "What? Inheritance? From her grandmother? So no, Mother, Grace doesn't need a reference from us. She doesn't need this job. She doesn't need anything from this family." He turned to Grace. "Come on. Jonathan's waiting." Grace's legs felt like water, but she managed to follow Preston toward the door. Behind them, Eleanor stood frozen on the stairs, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Wait," Eleanor finally said. "That's not— You're lying. There's no way." Preston opened the front door. "Goodbye, Mother. We'll be back this afternoon to collect Grace's things." They walked out into the cool October morning. Preston's Mercedes was parked in the circular driveway, gleaming black and silver. He opened the passenger door for Grace, actually opened the door for her like she was someone who mattered, and waited until she was settled before closing it gently. As they pulled away from the mansion, Grace finally found her voice. "Did I just quit my job?" Preston glanced at her, a slight smile on his face. "Did you want to stay?" Grace thought about it, about the basement room, about being invisible, about Eleanor's expression just now, that mixture of shock and disgust. "No," she said quietly. "No, I didn't want to stay." "Good. Because that was incredibly satisfying and I'd hate to have done it for nothing." They drove in silence for a few minutes, leaving Greenwich behind and heading toward the highway. The morning traffic was light. The world felt strange and new. "Why are you doing this?" Grace finally asked. "Helping me. Standing up to your mother. You don't owe me anything." Preston was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather, my father's father, he started with nothing. Literally nothing. Came to America from Ireland with $10 and a third-grade education. Worked on construction sites. Saved every penny. Eventually started his own development company. He merged onto I-95 South. He built everything this family has, and you know what? By the time I was born, my family had already forgotten where they came from, forgotten what it was like to actually work for something." He glanced at Grace. "Yesterday, when I saw that number on your screen, I realized something. You had almost $5 million and you were still scrubbing toilets. You were still being invisible, still surviving." His voice softened. "That kind of strength, that kind of humility. My family lost that generations ago. We could use a reminder." Grace felt tears prickling her eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Jonathan's office is in Midtown. Parking is hell, and he's going to ask you about 1,000 questions you probably won't know how to answer. I can handle that. I know you can. Preston turned on the radio, and soft jazz filled the car. Hey, Grace. Yeah? Welcome to the first day of your actual life. Grace looked out the window at the Connecticut landscape rushing past. Trees turning gold and red. The sky impossibly blue. Somewhere behind them, Eleanor Ashford was probably making phone calls, trying to understand what had just happened. But Grace wasn't thinking about Eleanor. She was thinking about her grandmother's note, about growing up strong, about options, about what came next. Jonathan Chen's office was nothing like Grace expected. She'd imagined something cold and corporate, glass walls, uncomfortable modern furniture, the kind of space designed to make regular people feel small. Instead, they walked into a converted brownstone in Midtown Manhattan, where the waiting room looked like someone's comfortable living room. Warm lighting, actual plants, furniture that invited you to sit rather than perch nervously. A young receptionist with purple hair and a genuine smile greeted them. Mr. Ashford, Ms. Holloway, Jonathan's expecting you. Can I get you coffee? Tea? Water? Coffee would be great, Preston said. Grace just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They were led upstairs to an office with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and windows overlooking a tree-lined street. Behind a large wooden desk sat a man in his mid-50s, Asian American, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, glasses perched on his nose. Jonathan Chen stood and extended his hand, first to Grace, then to Preston. Ms. Holloway. Preston. Please sit. His handshake was warm and firm. His smile reached his eyes. Grace felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. So, Jonathan said, settling back into his chair. Preston was characteristically vague on the phone, but he said you've come into some money and need guidance. Before we get into numbers, I want to explain how I work. He looked directly at Grace. I'm a fiduciary, which means I'm legally obligated to act in your best interest. I don't make commission on products I sell you because I don't sell products. You pay me a flat fee for advice, and that's it. No hidden agendas, no pressure to invest in things that benefit me more than you, clear? Grace nodded, surprised by his directness. Good. Now I'm going to ask you some questions. Some might feel intrusive, but I need a complete picture to give you proper advice. You can tell me if something's too personal, and we'll work around it. Fair? Fair, Grace managed to say. Excellent. Let's start simple. What's your current financial situation? Grace pulled out the folder of documents and handed them across the desk. My grandmother passed away 8 months ago. She left me everything. I didn't know about it until yesterday. Jonathan opened the folder and started reading. His expression remained professional, but Grace saw his eyebrows rise slightly when he reached the account summary. 4.8 million, he said quietly, from a land sale. Yes, sir. And prior to this inheritance, what was your financial situation? Grace felt her face warm. I was a live-in maid, I made about $28,000 a year. I had maybe $2,000 in savings, and about $3,000 in credit card debt. Jonathan made notes without judgment. Family obligations? Dependents? No. My grandmother was my only family. It was just me sending money to help with her care, but Grace's voice caught. But apparently she didn't need it. She was teaching you, Jonathan said gently, looking up from his notes. My grandmother did something similar. She owned a restaurant in San Francisco, made good money, but she still clipped coupons and bought day-old bread. After she died, I found out she'd saved over $1 million. I was angry at first, angry that she'd lived so frugally when she didn't have to. But then I realized she was teaching me and my siblings about value, about not taking anything for granted. Grace felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back. Okay, Jonathan continued. Let's talk about what happens next. First, this money is in a standard savings account, which means it's earning basically nothing in interest. We need to move it somewhere that works for you. But before we do that, I need to understand what you want. Not what you think you should want, what you actually want. So tell me, Grace, if money wasn't an issue, what would your life look like? The question caught Grace completely off guard. In 34 years, no one had ever asked her that. I don't know, she admitted. That's okay. Let's try differently. What do you hate about your life right now? That was easier. I hate being invisible. I hate feeling small. I hate living in a basement room and being treated like I don't matter. I hate. She paused, surprised by the anger in her own voice. I hate that I've spent 7 years making rich people comfortable while barely surviving myself. Preston shifted in his chair beside her, but Grace didn't look at him. Good, Jonathan said, and he sounded like he meant it. Now we're getting somewhere. What do you like? What makes you happy? Grace thought hard. I like reading. I used to read all the time when I was younger. Libraries were my favorite place. And I like... She hesitated. This is going to sound silly. Nothing silly here. I like helping people. Real people, not just cleaning up after people who don't need help. Back in Georgia, I used to volunteer at a community center, teaching kids to read, helping seniors with paperwork they didn't understand. I felt useful, like I mattered. Jonathan made more notes. Education level? High school diploma. I had a partial scholarship to Georgia State, but I couldn't afford the rest, so Grace shrugged. I worked instead. Did you want to go to college? More than anything. What would you have studied? Social work probably, or education. Something where I could actually help people. Jonathan smiled, a real warm smile. Ms. Holloway, I'm going to be direct with you. $4.8 million properly managed will generate approximately $200,000 per year in passive income, possibly more, depending on how we invest it. That's $200,000 you don't have to work for, it just exists. Grace stared at him. That's not possible. It's not only possible, it's conservative. Now here's what I recommend. He pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out a plan. We're going to divide your inheritance into several buckets. First, an emergency fund, 6 months of living expenses and a high-yield savings account. That's your safety net. Never touch it unless you absolutely have to. He drew a box on the paper. Second, a short-term investment account, maybe $500,000 in relatively safe investments. Bonds, dividend-paying stocks, maybe some real estate investment trusts. This is money you can access within a year or two if needed, but it's still growing. Another box. Third, and this is the big one, long-term growth. We'll put the bulk of your inheritance here. Diversified index funds, some individual stocks in solid companies, maybe some international investments. This is your retirement money, your generational wealth. You don't touch this for at least 10 years, ideally 20 or 30. Let compound interest do the heavy lifting. A third, larger box. Fourth, a life happens fund. This is maybe $200,000 that you can use for whatever improves your quality of life right now. Education, a place to live, a car, whatever you need to transition from survival mode to actually living. A fourth box connected to all the others. Grace stared at the diagram. And all of this will make $200,000 a year? Conservatively, yes, maybe more. But here's the thing, Grace, and this is crucial. You're young. You're 34. If you're smart about this, you never have to worry about money again. Not just for yourself, but for your children, your grandchildren. Your grandmother gave you something extraordinary. Now we need to protect it and grow it. What about taxes? Preston asked suddenly. Won't she owe? Estate taxes were already paid, Jonathan said, flipping through the documents. The lawyers handling your grandmother's estate took care of that. What you received is the net amount. It's yours free and clear. Grace felt dizzy again. What do I do first? First, you do nothing. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. You're in shock. You just learned your entire life has changed. Making big decisions right now would be stupid. So here's my advice. We'll move your money out of that basic savings account and into something that earns actual interest while you figure things out. Then you take a month, maybe 2. You breathe. You process. You think about what you actually want. And when you're ready, we'll execute a real plan. But don't I need to? You don't need to do anything, Jonathan interrupted gently. That's the whole point. You have options now. Time is on your side for the first time in your adult life. Use it. The meeting lasted another hour. Jonathan explained investment strategies, tax implications, the importance of keeping the inheritance quiet until she had a plan. He talked about predatory financial advisors, family members who might suddenly appear, con artists who targeted new wealth. Trust no one who promises quick returns or guaranteed profits, he said seriously. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. And if someone tells you about an amazing opportunity that you have to act on immediately, run. When they finally stood to leave, Jonathan shook Grace's hand again. One more thing. Preston mentioned you worked as a maid. Past tense, what are you doing now? I quit this morning, Grace said. Or Preston quit for me. I'm not entirely sure which. Jonathan laughed. Good. You're worth more than that. Take some time. Figure out who you want to be and then be that person. The money is just a tool. You're the one who decides what to build with it. Outside, the midday sun was bright and warm. Preston led Grace to a small cafe a few blocks away, where they sat at an outdoor table and ordered lunch. Grace wasn't hungry, but Preston insisted she eat something. "You did good in there," he said, attacking a turkey sandwich. "Asking questions, being honest about what you don't know. That's smart." Grace picked at a salad. "I feel like I'm in a dream, like I'm going to wake up in my basement room and none of this will be real." "It's real." Preston set down his sandwich. "Grace, can I ask you something?" "Sure. What are you going to do? Not with the money, with your life. Because you've got options now, like Jonathan said, so what do you want?" Grace was quiet for a long time. She watched people walking past, professionals in suits, students with backpacks, tourists taking photos, people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, or just surviving, like she'd been doing. "I think," she said slowly, "I want to go back to school, finish my degree, maybe become a social worker like I originally wanted." She looked at Preston. "Is that stupid? Using this money to do something that won't make more money? That's literally the least stupid thing I've ever heard." Preston smiled. "My grandfather always said the best investments are in yourself. Everything else is just numbers on a screen." They finished lunch and headed back to Greenwich. During the drive, Grace felt something shifting inside her. The fear was still there, the terror of so much change happening so fast, but underneath it was something else. Hope, maybe, or possibility. As they pulled into the circular driveway of the Ashford mansion, Grace saw her future splitting into before and after. Before yesterday, when she was invisible. After yesterday, when she became visible. "Ready to get your stuff?" Preston asked, turning off the engine. "Ready as I'll ever be." They walked into the mansion together. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen, which Grace found more unsettling than if she'd been waiting in the foyer. Preston led her downstairs to her basement room. "I'll help you pack. You probably don't have much, right?" "Not really." Grace pulled her single suitcase out from under the bed. 7 years, and this is all I accumulated. That's about to change." They packed in comfortable silence. Clothes, a few books, some photos of her grandmother. Grace's entire life fit into one suitcase and 2 shopping bags. It should have been depressing, but instead it felt freeing, like she was shedding an old skin. As they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, Eleanor appeared at the top. She'd clearly been waiting. "Grace," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "I'd like to speak with you, privately." Preston stepped forward. "Anything you need to say to Grace, you can say in front of me." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "This doesn't concern you. She doesn't work here anymore, Mother. You have no authority over her." "I'm not trying to exercise authority. I'm trying to offer assistance." Eleanor looked at Grace with an expression that might have been mistaken for concern if you didn't know her. "Grace, dear, I think you're making a terrible mistake. Preston has filled your head with fantasies about this supposed inheritance, but it's not a fantasy," Grace said quietly. "It's real. Even if it is," Eleanor continued smoothly, "money like that, sudden, unearned money, it destroys people. Especially people who aren't prepared to handle it. You'll make poor decisions. People will take advantage of you. Within a year, you'll have nothing left." "That's not going to happen," Preston said. "Let her speak for herself." Eleanor kept her eyes on Grace. "You've been with this family for 7 years. We've provided for you, given you stability, a roof over your head. Don't throw that away for some windfall that might not even be real." Grace felt the old instinct rising, the urge to apologize, to shrink, to make herself invisible again. Eleanor's words were designed to make her doubt herself, doubt her worth, doubt that someone like her deserved anything good. But then Grace thought about her grandmother's note, about growing up strong, about Jonathan's words. "You're worth more than that." "Mrs. Ashford," Grace said, her voice steady, "thank you for your concern, but I'm not throwing anything away. I'm claiming something that's mine, something my grandmother worked her entire life to give me." Eleanor's expression hardened. "You'll regret this. Maybe, but it'll be my regret, my choice, my life." Grace picked up her suitcase. "For the first time in a very long time, I get to decide what happens next, and I'm grateful for that." She walked past Eleanor without waiting for a response. Preston followed, carrying the shopping bags. They loaded everything into Preston's car in silence. As they prepared to drive away, Grace took one last look at the mansion, the place where she'd spent 7 years being invisible, being small, being less than she was. Goodbye, she whispered. Preston started the engine. Where to? Do you have someplace to stay? Grace realized she hadn't even thought about that. No, I guess I need to find a hotel or something. No hotels. Preston pulled out onto the road. There's a guest house on the estate, separate from the main house, not fancy but comfortable. My grandfather built it for visiting business partners. It's been empty for months. Stay there while you figure things out. Preston, I can't. Yes, you can. Consider it my apology for 7 years of being blind. He glanced at her. Besides, it'll irritate my mother, which is honestly reason enough. Despite everything, Grace laughed. You're kind of terrible. I'm aware. Preston grinned. But I'm trying to be less terrible. Give me credit for growth. The guest house was small but beautiful. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a living room with large windows overlooking the gardens. It was more space than Grace had ever had to herself. There's no food, but I'll have some delivered, Preston said, showing her around. Wi-Fi password is on the refrigerator. Take as much time as you need. After he left, Grace stood in the middle of the living room, her suitcase at her feet, and finally let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. The grief for her grandmother, the anger at having been invisible for so long, the terror of so much change, the overwhelming, dizzying, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, her life was about to become something worth living. She pulled out her phone and opened the banking app. The number was still there, still real. Grace Marie Holloway had $4.8 million, and absolutely no idea what came next. But for the first time in her entire life, she couldn't wait to find out. 3 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, decisions, and the strange, disorienting sensation of having time that belonged entirely to Grace. Jonathan had been right. Doing nothing was exactly what she needed. For the first week, Grace barely left the guest house. She slept until she woke naturally without an alarm. She cooked meals in a kitchen that was hers to use. She sat in the garden reading books she'd always wanted to read but never had time for. It felt wrong at first, wasteful, like she should be doing something, serving someone, earning her right to exist in this space. But slowly, something shifted. Grace began to remember who she'd been before survival became her only goal, before invisibility became her armor, before she'd learned to make herself small enough to fit into other people's lives without causing disruption. She'd been a girl who loved learning, who volunteered at community centers because helping people made her feel purposeful, who'd dreamed of becoming a social worker and making a real difference in the world. That girl was still there, just buried under years of exhaustion and diminished expectations. On day 8, Grace enrolled in online classes at a community college, just 2 courses to start. Introduction to Social Work and Composition. Baby steps toward the degree she'd abandoned 15 years ago. On day 12, she bought a car. Nothing extravagant. A 3-year-old Honda Civic with good safety ratings and reasonable mileage. But it was hers. The first car she'd ever owned. On day 15, Preston knocked on her door with Chinese takeout and an unexpected proposal. "I need your help," he said, settling onto the couch in her living room with his container of lo mein. "And before you say no, hear me out." Grace sat across from him, suspicious but curious. "What kind of help?" "You know how I told you my grandfather built everything this family has? Well, part of that legacy is the Ashford Foundation. It's a charitable organization that's supposed to fund community programs, education initiatives, that kind of thing." Preston stabbed at his noodles with more force than necessary. "Except for the past decade, my mother has been running it, and she's turned it into basically a tax write-off. They fund a few high-profile galas, donate to museums where she can get her name on a plaque, but nothing that actually helps people who need it." "Okay," Grace said slowly. And I'm taking it over." My father agreed. He's as tired of my mother's vanity projects as I am. But I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm good at spending money, not distributing it responsibly. He looked at Grace with surprising vulnerability. "You know what real need looks like. You know what actually helps people versus what just looks good in a press release. I want you to help me rebuild the foundation into something that matters." Grace set down her container. "Preston, I don't have any experience with—" "You have exactly the experience that matters. You've lived it." He leaned forward. "Look, I'll pay you a salary, a real one, not whatever insulting amount my family was giving you before. You'll be a full consultant, help me figure out where the money should go, which programs to fund, how to actually make a difference. And," he hesitated, "it would give you something to do while you're figuring out your next steps. Something meaningful." Grace considered it. The idea appealed to her more than she wanted to admit. "What does your mother think about this?" "She's furious, which honestly makes me want to do it even more." Preston grinned. "But seriously, she can't stop it. The foundation is technically controlled by my father, and he's on board. Eleanor can throw a fit, but that's all she can do." "When would this start?" "Whenever you're ready. Next week. Next month. Your timeline." Grace thought about her grandmother's note. "Use it wisely. Use it kindly. I want to visit some community centers first," she said. "Talk to people running programs with actual impact. See what they need." Preston's smile widened. "See, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. When do we start?" "We? You think I'm letting you do all the work while I sit around taking credit? I want to learn how to do this right." He stood, gathering the empty containers. "How about Monday? We'll start in New Haven, work our way through some of the programs there, then hit Bridgeport and Hartford." "You're serious about this?" "For the first time in my life, I think I am." Preston headed toward the door, then paused. "Grace, thank you for giving me a chance to be better than I was." After he left, Grace sat in the quiet living room and thought about the strange turns life could take. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible. Now she was being asked to help distribute millions of dollars to people who needed it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. "Heard about the foundation project. Eleanor is having an absolute meltdown. This is the most entertainment I've had in years. Proud of you." Grace smiled and texted back, "Thank you for everything. Come visit soon." The response was immediate. "Try to stop me." That night, Grace pulled out her laptop and started researching community programs in Connecticut. Youth centers, literacy programs, food banks, housing assistance, mental health services. The list was endless, the needs overwhelming. But for the first time, Grace had the resources to actually help. Not just with her time, but with real financial support that could change lives. She worked until past midnight, making notes, bookmarking websites, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Preston picked her up at 8, bringing coffee and bagels, and they headed north toward New Haven. Their first stop was a community center in a struggling neighborhood, a converted warehouse that served as an after-school program, adult education center, and food distribution site. The director, a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, gave them a tour that was equal parts inspiring and heartbreaking. "We serve about 300 families a week," Carmen explained, leading them through a room where volunteers were packing food boxes. "But we could serve 3 times that if we had the resources. We had to cut our summer program last year because we couldn't afford to pay staff. And our computer lab," she gestured toward a room with ancient desktop computers. "Half of those don't work. Kids are trying to do homework on machines from 2008. Grace took notes while Preston asked questions. Real questions, showing genuine interest rather than the polite but distant curiosity she'd expected from him. "What's your annual budget?" Preston asked. "About 200,000 sounds like a lot, but when you're feeding families, running programs, maintaining the building." Carmen shrugged. "We make it work. We always do. But imagine what we could do with real funding." After they left, Preston was quiet for a long time as they drove to their next location. "That computer lab," he said finally. "I spent more than that on my car. 1 car. And these kids can't even do their homework properly." "Now you're starting to see it," Grace said softly. They visited 5 more programs that day. Each one told a similar story. Dedicated people doing extraordinary work with impossible resources. Teachers buying supplies with their own money. Social workers handling caseloads twice what they should be. Volunteers working 60-hour weeks because paid staff positions didn't exist. By the time they returned to Greenwich that evening, Preston looked exhausted. But it was a different kind of tired than Grace had seen on him before. Not the exhaustion of hangovers and late parties, but the weariness that comes from having your eyes opened. "We have so much money," he said almost to himself. "The foundation has millions just sitting there, and these people are struggling for what amounts to pocket change to us. So let's change that," Grace said. Over the next week, they visited programs in Bridgeport, Hartford, Waterbury, and Stamford. They met single mothers trying to finish their GEDs while working 2 jobs. They met formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives with almost no support. They met teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to go and no one to help them. And slowly, a plan began to take shape. Grace and Preston worked together in the guest house living room. Laptops open, papers spread across the coffee table. They identified 20 programs that were doing exceptional work with minimal resources. They calculated how much funding each needed to expand their impact. They built budgets, timelines, accountability measures. We should fund them for 3 years minimum, Grace insisted. 1-year grants sound good, but they force organizations to spend half their time fundraising for next year instead of doing the actual work. 3 years, Preston agreed, making notes. With clear benchmarks but flexibility to adapt. These people know their communities better than we ever will. Eleanor found out about the plan on a Wednesday afternoon. Grace heard the shouting from inside the guest house, Eleanor's voice carrying across the garden, sharp and furious. Grace stepped outside to see Eleanor storming toward the guest house, with Preston following calmly behind her. "This is absurd," Eleanor was saying. "You want to give away millions to programs that aren't even properly vetted? Based on the advice of a former maid? Based on the advice of someone who actually understands need," Preston corrected. "And they're not unvetted. We've spent 2 weeks reviewing their work, their budgets, their impact. These are solid organizations." Eleanor reached the guest house and turned her fury on Grace. "This is your doing. You got your money and now you're poisoning my son's mind, convincing him to throw away his inheritance on people who need it?" Grace said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "On programs that change lives? Yes, Mrs. Ashford. That's exactly what we're doing. You have no right." Actually, she has every right. Preston stepped between them. Grace is a paid consultant to the foundation. Her recommendations carry the same weight as any other advisor. More, actually, because unlike most advisors, she's not trying to profit from this. Eleanor's face went pale, then red. "You're paying her? $75,000 a year, yes, plus benefits. It's in the foundation budget, properly documented, completely legal. You're both..." Eleanor seemed unable to find words adequate to her rage. Finally, she turned to Grace with venom in her eyes. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Coming into our lives, manipulating my son, stealing..." "I haven't stolen anything," Grace said quietly. "I earned my inheritance through years of hard work and sacrifice. And now I'm trying to help other people who are where I was. Struggling, invisible, barely surviving. If that makes you angry, Mrs. Ashford, maybe you should ask yourself why." Eleanor stared at Grace with something close to hatred. Then without another word, she turned and walked back toward the main house. Preston let out a long breath. "Well, that went about as well as expected." "I'm sorry," Grace said. "I didn't mean to cause problems between you and your mother." "You didn't cause anything. This has been coming for years." Preston ran a hand through his hair. "My mother has spent decades controlling everything around her. It's about time someone stood up to her. I'm just glad it was you." That evening, Grace received an email from Jonathan Chen. The subject line read, "First quarter returns." She opened it with trembling hands. Her investment portfolio had been active for 3 weeks. In that time, the carefully diversified investments Jonathan had recommended had grown by $43,000. Grace read the number 3 times, $43,000 in 3 weeks, without her doing anything. She thought about Carmen Rodriguez and her underfunded community center, about the broken computers and the cut summer programs, about how $43,000 could change everything for them. Grace pulled out her laptop and drafted an email to Preston. "I want to donate my investment returns to the foundation. Every quarter. Whatever I make from the investments goes directly to funding programs." His response came within minutes. "That's incredible. But are you sure? That's your money." Grace wrote back, "My grandmother worked 60 years for this. The least I can do is make sure it helps people who need it. Let's start with Carmen's Center, new computers, summer program funding, whatever they need." Preston's reply made her smile. "You're going to change the world. I'm honored to help you do it." Grace closed her laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the November evening was settling in. Early darkness, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby, the first hints of winter in the air. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible, a maid in a basement room living on scraps and hope. Now she was Grace Holloway, student, consultant, philanthropist, someone with options, someone with purpose, someone who mattered. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Hi Grace, this is Carmen Rodriguez from the New Haven Community Center. Preston told me about your donation. I don't have adequate words to thank you. You're literally changing lives. Our kids are going to have computers that work. Our families will have summer programs. Because of you. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you anyway. You're an angel." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't sad tears. They were the tears of someone who'd finally found her purpose, who'd finally become visible in a way that mattered. She texted back, "You're the one changing lives. I'm just grateful I can help. This is only the beginning." And it was. And Over the next week, the Ashford Foundation officially announced its new direction. 20 programs across Connecticut would receive 3-year grants totaling $2 million. The press release included quotes from Grace, identified as the Foundation's Director of Community Impact, talking about the importance of supporting grassroots organizations doing frontline work. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations called for interviews. National philanthropy magazines wrote articles. Other foundations reached out asking about their model. But more importantly, the programs themselves began to transform. Carmen's Center bought new computers and hired 2 additional staff members. A literacy program in Bridgeport expanded to serve 3 more schools. A mental health clinic in Hartford was able to cut their waiting list from 6 months to 6 weeks. Real change, real impact, real lives transformed. Grace stood in her guest house one evening, looking at a wall where she'd hung thank you letters from the programs they'd funded. Dozens of them, each one representing families helped, lives changed, futures brightened. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Use it wisely, use it kindly. I'm trying, Grandma, Grace whispered. I'm really trying. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Preston stood outside, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression Grace couldn't quite read. We need to celebrate, he said. Do you have any idea what you've started? Grace let him in. What do you mean? My father just called. 3 other families with private foundations have contacted him asking about our model. They want to restructure their giving to focus on community impact instead of vanity projects. Preston set the wine on the counter and turned to face her, his expression serious. Grace, you're starting a movement. You're changing how wealthy families think about philanthropy. We're changing it, Grace corrected. This isn't just me. It started with you. With your courage to stand up to my mother. With your understanding of what real need looks like. With your willingness to use your own story to help others. Preston smiled. You know what my grandfather would have said? He would have said you're exactly the kind of person who deserves wealth, because you understand that it's not about you. It's about what you can do with it. Grace felt emotion welling up again. Your grandfather sounds like he was a good man. He was. And I think, Preston's voice caught slightly, I think he would have liked you. He spent his whole life trying to teach us that wealth comes with responsibility, that we're supposed to use what we have to lift others up. But my generation forgot that lesson, until you reminded us. They opened the wine and sat in the living room, talking late into the night about plans for the foundation, about Grace's classes, about the future. And for the first time since her grandmother's death, Grace felt like she understood the gift she'd been given. Not just the money, anyone could have money, but the opportunity. The chance to transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. The chance to be visible in a way that mattered. The chance to make a difference. The chance to honor her grandmother's sacrifice by becoming exactly the kind of person Dorothy Holloway had raised her to be. Strong, kind, purposeful, and unafraid. Grace Marie Holloway had come a long way from that scared woman whispering, I just want to see my balance in a millionaire's study. But the journey was only beginning. 6 months later, Grace stood in front of 200 people at the Connecticut Community Impact Summit and felt her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the podium. The ballroom at the Hartford Convention Center was packed. Nonprofit directors, foundation leaders, government officials, community organizers, all of them waiting to hear her speak. Grace Holloway, former Invisible Maid, now keynote speaker. Good morning, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 6 months ago, I was living in a basement room making minimum wage and convinced that I didn't matter, that people like me, poor, black, working class, were meant to stay invisible, to survive, not to thrive. The room was silent, attentive. Then everything changed. Not just because I inherited money, but because I finally understood something my grandmother had been trying to teach me my whole life. Grace paused, looking out at the faces watching her. She taught me that worth isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by what you do with what you have. And that dignity, real dignity, comes from lifting others up, not from climbing over them. She clicked to the first slide, photos of the 20 programs the Ashford Foundation had funded. These organizations represent what's possible when we invest in people instead of prestige, when we fund need instead of photo opportunities, when we trust community leaders to know what their communities require. Grace walked them through the results. Carmen's Community Center had tripled its capacity. The literacy program in Bridgeport had improved reading scores by an average of 2 grade levels. The mental health clinic in Hartford had served over 300 additional clients. But numbers only tell part of the story, Grace continued. The real story is about people. She clicked to a new slide, a photo of a young woman in a graduation gown. This is Destiny. She's 19. A year ago, she was aging out of foster care with nowhere to go and no support system. The foundation helped fund a transitional housing program that gave her a safe place to live while she finished high school and started community college. Last month, she graduated with honors. Next fall, she's transferring to UConn on a full scholarship to study social work. Grace's voice grew stronger. That's what your investment looks like. Not a tax deduction, not a name on a building. A young woman who's going to spend her life helping others because someone helped her first. The applause was immediate and thunderous. Grace continued for another 20 minutes, sharing stories of transformation, discussing sustainable funding models, challenging wealthy donors to think differently about philanthropy. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. As Grace left the stage, Preston was waiting in the wings, grinning. You killed it. Absolutely killed it. I was terrified, Grace admitted. Couldn't tell at all. Come on, there are about 50 people who want to talk to you. He wasn't exaggerating. For the next hour, Grace was surrounded by foundation directors, nonprofit leaders, and donors, all wanting to know more about their model, asking for advice, requesting meetings. Among the crowd was a distinguished-looking black woman in her 60s who waited patiently until the others had dispersed before approaching Grace. Ms. Holloway, I'm Dr. Patricia Wright. I run the social work program at Yale. She extended her hand. That was a remarkable presentation. Your grandmother would be very proud. Grace shook her hand, surprised. You knew my grandmother? Not personally, but I know her story. Dorothy Holloway held on to that land for decades despite constant pressure to sell. She understood its value, not just financially but historically. That land represented generations of black ownership in the South, which is precious and rare. Dr. Wright smiled gently. She made sure that legacy became your foundation. Quite literally. Grace felt tears threatening. I wish she could see what we're doing with it. Oh, I think she knew exactly what you'd do with it. That's why she gave it to you. Dr. Wright handed Grace a business card. I'd love to talk to you about our program. You mentioned you're studying social work. Have you considered graduate school? I'm still working on my bachelor's degree, Grace said. I'm only taking 2 classes at a time while I work with the foundation. What if you could do both? Full-time graduate study and continue your foundation work? Dr. Wright's eyes sparkled. We have a fellowship program specifically for students with real-world experience who want to create systemic change. Full tuition, stipend, flexible schedule. Your application would be very competitive. Grace stared at her. Are you serious? Completely. Think about it. Email me if you're interested. Dr. Wright squeezed Grace's hand. The world needs more social workers who understand both poverty and privilege, who can bridge those worlds. That's you, Grace. After the conference, Preston drove Grace back to Greenwich. She'd moved out of the guest house 2 months ago into a modest apartment in New Haven, close to her classes, close to the program she worked with, but she still visited regularly, and Preston had become more friend than former employer. Yale, Preston said as they drove. That's huge, Grace. It's terrifying, Grace corrected. Me at Yale? I barely finished high school. You're finishing your bachelor's with a 4.0 GPA while revolutionizing philanthropy in Connecticut. You're exactly who belongs at Yale. He glanced at her. Are you going to apply? Grace thought about it, about her grandmother, about how far she'd come, about Destiny and Carmen, and all the people whose lives had changed because someone believed in them. Yeah, she said quietly. I think I am. 3 weeks later, Grace sat in her apartment completing her fellowship application when her phone rang. An unknown number with a Georgia area code. Hello? Is this Grace Holloway? A woman's voice, warm and slightly uncertain. Yes, this is Grace. Oh, thank goodness. My name is Reverend Martha Williams. I'm calling from Valdosta. I knew your grandmother. We attended the same church for 40 years. Grace sat up straighter. Reverend Williams, my grandmother mentioned you. She mentioned you constantly, dear. Talked about you every Sunday. How proud she was of you, how hard you worked. The Reverend's voice softened. Grace, I'm calling because I thought you should know something. Your grandmother. She knew she was dying. About 2 years before she passed, she was diagnosed with cancer. She refused treatment, said she'd lived a full life and was ready when the Lord called her. Grace's breath caught. She never told me. She didn't want you to worry. Didn't want you rushing home and sacrificing your work. But in those final years, she made very specific plans. The land sale wasn't an accident or last-minute decision. She spent months negotiating, making sure she got every penny it was worth. All for you. Tears streamed down Grace's face. Why are you telling me this now? Because I found something while cleaning out the church office. A letter your grandmother left with me. She asked me to give it to you after enough time had passed, after you'd had a chance to use her gift. I think 6 months is enough time. Papers rustled on the other end. Would you like me to read it to you? Please, Grace whispered. Reverend Williams cleared her throat and began to read in a voice thick with emotion. My dearest Grace, if you're hearing this, you've had time to discover what I left you, and I hope you've forgiven me for keeping it secret. I wanted you to grow up knowing the value of work, of sacrifice, of earning your dignity. Money can't teach those lessons. Only struggle can. That land, our family's land, it holds so much pain and so much pride. Your great-great-grandparents bought it in 1874, just 9 years after slavery ended. They were born enslaved, Grace, born as property, and they died as property owners. That's not just land, that's freedom, that's legacy. I held on to it all these years because I wanted to pass that freedom to you. Not just the money, but what it represents. Generations of people who refused to be broken, who built something from nothing, who fought for dignity in a world that denied it to them. Now it's yours. Use it the way our ancestors would have wanted, to lift others up, to fight for dignity, to be the voice for people who aren't heard. I know you will. I always knew you would. You have the strongest spirit of anyone I've ever known. You've spent your life making yourself small to survive, but you were meant to be big, to take up space, to matter. So matter, Grace, matter loudly and proudly and unapologetically. All my love, always and forever, Grandma Dorothy. Grace sobbed openly, holding the phone with shaking hands. Thank you, she managed to say. Thank you for reading that to me. She was so proud of you, Reverend Williams said gently. And I think wherever she is now, she's watching you change the world and smiling. After they hung up, Grace sat in her apartment for a long time, letting herself feel everything. The grief she'd pushed aside for months, the gratitude for a grandmother who'd loved her enough to let her struggle, the overwhelming responsibility of carrying forward a legacy built on generations of resilience. She pulled out her laptop and opened her graduate school application. In the section asking about her goals, Grace began to type, I want to create systemic change for communities that have been marginalized and ignored. I want to use my understanding of both poverty and privilege to build bridges between worlds that rarely communicate. I want to honor my ancestors, people who survived enslavement, who fought for dignity, who built legacies of resilience, by continuing their work in the 21st century. My grandmother gave me more than money. She gave me a mandate. Matter loudly and proudly and unapologetically. That's exactly what I intend to do. Grace hit submit and felt something settle in her chest. Purpose, direction, peace. Her phone buzzed. A text from Preston. Board meeting tomorrow at 10. We're voting on expanding the foundation to 3 more states. Your recommendation is carrying the room. You're officially unstoppable. Grace smiled and texted back. We're unstoppable. This was always a team effort. His response came immediately. Started with you, though. Always started with you. That evening, Grace attended her social work class, the last session of the semester. Her professor, Dr. Michaels, handed back their final papers. Grace had written about dignity in social services, drawing on her own experiences as both recipient and now provider of support. At the top of her paper, in red ink, A+. This is exceptional work, Grace. You're going to change the field. After class, Grace walked through New Haven's streets, the city she now called home. She passed the community center where she volunteered twice a week, the coffee shop where she studied, the library where she spent hours researching best practices in philanthropy. This was her life now. Student, advocate, changemaker, not invisible, not small, not surviving, living, thriving, mattering. Grace's phone rang again. Jonathan Chen this time. Grace, I have your quarterly report. You sitting down? Should I be? Your portfolio grew by $98,000 this quarter. Plus, you're on track to graduate debt-free. You have 3 years of living expenses saved, and your long-term investments are performing exceptionally well. He paused. Grace, at this rate, you'll be worth over $6 million by the time you're 40, and that's being conservative. Grace leaned against a building, processing the numbers. $6 million. From careful investing and smart decisions, from honoring her grandmother's gift instead of squandering it, "Jonathan, I want to donate the quarterly gains again, all 98,000, to the foundation." I figured you'd say that. She could hear the smile in his voice. "You're a good person, Grace Holloway. A really good person. I'm trying to be worthy of what I was given. You already are, but keep trying anyway. The world needs more people like you." That night, Grace sat at her small kitchen table and wrote in the journal she'd started keeping. At the top of the page, she wrote the date, May 15th, exactly 6 months since the day she'd whispered, "I just want to see my balance." And everything changed. "Dear Grandma, I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. It was never about the money. It was about knowing my worth before I had wealth, about being strong before I had options, about understanding struggle so I could help others through it. You gave me more than an inheritance. You gave me a purpose, a legacy, a mandate to matter. I'm applying to Yale's social work program. I'm expanding the foundation to help more communities. I'm using my story to challenge other people with wealth to think differently about their responsibility. I'm taking up space, Grandma, just like you wanted. I'm mattering loudly and proudly and unapologetically. And every day I'm trying to make you proud. I love you. I miss you. And I promise, to use this gift exactly as you intended, to lift others up, to fight for dignity, to be the voice for people who aren't heard. Thank you for believing I could. Love always, Grace." She closed the journal and looked around her small apartment. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with basic furniture and walls she'd painted herself, but it was hers, truly hers, from invisible maid to visible changemaker, from basement room to graduate school bound, from surviving to thriving. Grace Marie Holloway had come home to herself, and in doing so, she'd opened the door for countless others to do the same. The screen had lit up that day 6 months ago, showing an impossible number, but the real miracle wasn't the balance. It was everything Grace chose to do with it, everything she chose to become because of it, everything her grandmother had known she would be all along. 2 years later, Grace stood in the Yale School of Social Work auditorium, her master's degree diploma in hand, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Preston was there, front row, cheering louder than anyone else. Mrs. Chen sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Carmen Rodriguez had driven up from New Haven with a group of teenagers from the community center, kids who now called Grace their mentor. But it was the empty seat Grace had reserved in the front row that made her pause, the seat with a single white rose laid across it, for Dorothy Holloway, who'd made all of this possible. After the ceremony, Grace was surrounded by congratulations. But the most meaningful moment came when Dr. Patricia Wright approached with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Dr. Holloway," she said, emphasizing the title Grace would earn once she completed her doctorate, which she'd already been accepted into. "Not yet," Grace laughed. "Just Master Holloway for now." "For now," Dr. Wright agreed. "But I have no doubt you'll get there. Your thesis on dignity-centered social work is already being cited. You're changing the field, Grace, just like I knew you would." That evening, the Ashford Foundation hosted a celebration, not at some fancy venue, but at Carmen's Community Center, the place where it had all begun. Over 100 people came, program directors, community members, the families whose lives had been transformed. Preston raised his glass for a toast. 2 years ago, Grace Holloway taught me that wealth without purpose is just numbers on a screen. Today, the Ashford Foundation operates in 8 states, has funded over 60 programs, and has directly impacted more than 10,000 lives. And it all started because one brave woman whispered, "I just want to see my balance," and refused to stay invisible. The room erupted in applause. Grace stood, her heart full. "My grandmother used to say that our worth isn't in what we have, but in what we do with what we have." Every person in this room, every volunteer, every program director, every family we've served, you've proven that dignity, purpose, and community matter more than anything money can buy. She looked around at faces that had become family. "Thank you for letting me be part of something bigger than myself, for teaching me that being visible means using your voice to amplify others." As the celebration continued, Grace stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The November air was crisp, reminding her of that day 2 years ago when everything changed. Her phone buzzed. An email from the mayor's office. They wanted to discuss a citywide initiative Grace had proposed for affordable housing and job training. Grace smiled. There was always more work to do, more people to help, more systems to change. But tonight, she'd celebrate how far she'd come. Celebrate the legacy her grandmother had entrusted to her. Celebrate the fact that Grace Marie Holloway, once invisible, once small, once silent, now mattered in ways she'd never imagined possible. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "I hope I'm making you proud, Grandma." Somewhere she knew Dorothy Holloway was smiling.